Taiwan's COVID-19 situation is getting worse. The rate of death and severe cases in the country is well past the global average. Still, the government refuses to administer open testing. With every death and every backlog case, the people lose their trust in the government. It's clear that the Tsai administration doesn't know when to reflect. They insist on fast-tracking domestic vaccines for an August rollout, despite the fact the vaccines have not yet passed Phase 2 clinical trials. From recent events, we see how Tsai wages war on perception. Her hordes of netizens lambast and shame people who sit on the vaccine review committee who dare to go against her will. Taiwan has entered the golden age of Tsai, an era where truth cannot exist. ThesisGate has exposed the worst the government has to offer. It shows how Taiwan has been transformed into a fascist state where false information reigns supreme. People buy into the lies served by the leaders, granting even more power to those who are undeserving. In this chaotic time, ThesisGate insists on upholding the truth. With us, truth is non-negotiable. Last episode, we discussed how the University of London will have to face the truth in the UK's tribunal court. Authorities in Taiwan have already admitted that Tsai returned it to Taiwan in September 1983 to teach at Soochow University. That concession has put the University of London in quite the conundrum, one where it has to come up with an entirely new story to accommodate these new details. Today, we'll continue our deep dive into the year 1983. 1983 is a year that's missing from Tsai's Wikipedia biography. When exactly did Tsai return to Taiwan? Where did she write her thesis? How will the University of London explain the inconsistencies in Tsai's story? The UK court date is quickly approaching. It's very possible that ThesisGate will see a conclusion in June. What began as a simple credential verification has now become a bloated, complex web of lies thanks to Tsai. Because of her, this saga has now seen 3 different diplomas, 4 thesis topics, and 5 different course completion dates. Ultimately, the tale weaved here is absolute hogwash. For now, we'll stay away from the topic of visas and entry dates. Even if the University of London tries to go with the story that Tsai returned to London in October 1983 for her viva, after she started teaching at Soochow University in September of that year, it still has to convince the tribunal court that those events are true. But Tsai's tenure at Soochow University isn't the only fact that she'll have to face. The University of London is going to have to do more homework if it is going to convincingly corroborate Tsai Ing-wen's story. It needs to come up with a plausible 1983 timeline for Tsai. The University of London has stood by 3 facts throughout ThesisGate. 1. The thesis is available online. 2. Unfair trade practices and safeguard actions is listed in Legal Research in the United Kingdom 1905 to 1984, which IALS published in 1985. 3. The University of London says it has records of Tsai's viva, and that it also has records of her degree being conferred. These 3 facts are most likely details fed to the school by Tsai and her conspirators. Nothing here goes against the London School of Economics' October 8, 2019 statement. However, using the Freedom of Information Act, our investigators found tangible proof that can disprove all 3 of the University of London's so-called facts. We are going to save that evidence for the courts. That way, the opposition can't prepare for it. The University of London once disclosed to Michael Richardson that Tsai's viva took place on October 16, 1983, thinking he was just a small-time reporter. Since then, it has never once mentioned a specific date for Tsai's viva anywhere else. When exactly did Tsai Ing-wen leave London in 1983? That's the key. In 1983, Tsai said she got her thesis topic approved, submitted her thesis, and passed her viva. Former Mainland Affairs Council Minister Lai Xin-yuan once said that Tsai Ing-wen lived with her in the months leading up to her viva. Tsai also confirmed this.
我这个念完博士班，写完论文交上去以后，我有一段时间在等口试。结果我的英国同学呢也在写他的论文，所以我就帮他做一件事，我帮他校稿，还有改英文。
If Tsai's viva indeed took place on October 16, 1983, then, according to her, she was in London between June and October of that year. However, that story doesn't make sense anymore because it's confirmed that Tsai was teaching at Soochow University by September 1983. Tsai and Lai were lying. In her own public servant records, Tsai wrote that she completed her courses in May 1983. We also found documents that said Tsai applied for a teaching position at NCCU during that time. In fact, Tsai could have been in Taiwan earlier than that, considering her own sister said she wrote her thesis in Taiwan.
He 交论文的前一年，那年我们两个都有回台湾。我那时候问他写了多少，他说写了200多页。他训练自己每天一定要写3到5页。
It's clear that Tsai left London by May 1983, or perhaps even sometime earlier. Tsai may have been back by 1982, at a time when her thesis topic hadn't yet been approved. The first thing the University of London needs to explain to the courts is whether it would allow a student to write their thesis from abroad. Furthermore, how would advisor Michael Elliott have provided guidance? Through the phone or through mail? Are there any other students who were instructed in this way? Tsai most likely returned to Taiwan in the first half of 1983. That is something that would align with her student record, which showed she WD from course on November 10, 1982. The second thing the University of London would have to explain is whether or not it'd allow someone who was registered as WD to continue taking courses. Is Tsai the only person to do so, or are there other examples? In 1983, Tsai took her thesis, translated it into Chinese, and published it in a legal academic journal as a PhD in Taiwan. This was at a time when she hadn't passed her viva. The third question the University of London has to explain is, could a PhD candidate preemptively know if she would be granted a degree? The University of London can pawn the last question off on Tsai's own unethical behavior. However, the fact remains the University of London needs to provide a detailed account of Tsai's 1983 experience at the school. The school's hands are tied. It could falsify a document to say Tsai submitted her thesis in June 1983, but what if Tsai's travel records indicate she was in Taiwan? Could the school risk committing to a falsehood that can blow up in its face? It doesn't matter what WD means or entails. The University of London could say that it did things differently 37 years ago to cover for Tsai. However, it would be an absolute travesty if the school said Tsai was in London when she was actually in Taiwan. In order to avoid another incident like the Soochow University tenure coming to light, Tsai's conspirators can only hedge their bets safely. They have to come up with a story that is consistent with Tsai's travel records, no matter how improbable the details may be. They have to help Tsai come up with a one-of-a-kind, near-impossible story. Let's play this out and see how it looks. On November 10th, 1982, Tsai Ing-wen WDs from course due to financial difficulties. Here, WD just means Tsai doesn't take any classes. She can continue with her PhD studies. On November 22nd, 1982, the school registrar's office says that Tsai has already completed her minimum requirement, so she does not need to register. Because of this, Tsai doesn't need to pay tuition for her third and fourth years. However, she can still get a degree. How charitable. In January 1983, the head of Tsai's department says bloody hell when reading her thesis outline. Even though she's not a registered student, Tsai is still allowed to submit her thesis topic, and it is ultimately approved. Because she did not register, the London School of Economics' Department of Law does not have any records on Tsai Ing-wen. Her student record does not have anything regarding her conferment date or viva. How strange. For some reason, there's a problem with Tsai's visa. In February 1983, Michael Elliott writes a recommendation letter for her so that she can stay and continue her studies in London. In June 1983, Tsai Ing-wen submits a thesis she wrote over the course of 5 months. She wrote 3 to 5 pages every day and completed a 400-page thesis. Despite not being registered, Tsai is able to submit her thesis to the school. Because of this, Tsai's visa is extended. Again in June 1983, the University of London expedites reviewing Tsai's thesis. She is immediately given a viva date on June 10th, 1983. Both internal and external examiners are arranged for her. Her viva date is set for October 1983. But because Tsai has nothing better to do between June and October, Tsai decides to leave for Taiwan despite having the necessary visa to stay in London. She returns to Taiwan and splits her thesis, which is yet to pass a viva, and submits the separate parts to a Chinese language academic journal. She also applies for jobs at Soochow University and NCCU and accidentally becomes a lecturer at Soochow University in September 1983. In October 1983, Tsai casually boards a plane with her sister Tsai Ing-ling, and the two go to London for her viva. There, she impresses her examiners so much, they grant her 1.5 PhDs on the spot. The description of events above is the story surrounding Tsai's education that we're supposed to believe. We're not joking. The only ones joking are the presidential office and Tsai. They are the ones that came up with this ridiculous story. Whenever Tsai's people need to offer an explanation, they open their story up to more contradictions. The holes in Tsai's story are getting much bigger. The The crazy and implausible scenario above, well, that version of events has been included in the indictment letter Dr. Dennis Peng received. Prosecutor Huang Wei's indictment letter contains a lot of evidence, almost all of which are photocopies, mind you. The evidence he provides goes all the way back to 1980, and it includes details on things like Tsai's student visa and her diploma. The thing is, we're not questioning Tsai's admission into the school at all. For all the evidence he provided, Prosecutor Huang failed to include any information about Tsai's visa and her examiners. Huang provides nothing on the most vital aspect of this case. In fact, if you look at all the information closely, you'll see that there is absolutely nothing that provides information about Tsai's thesis submission. Huang can provide inconsequential details like Tsai's admission records, but he can't produce anything about Tsai's viva. He can obtain Tsai's thesis abstract, but he can't get the thesis itself. Huang can even get his hands on letters written by Tsai's instructors, but he doesn't have anything on her examiners. Let's not forget that this case is a public prosecution. Many of the details that Huang provided are clearly from Tsai's private collection, so where and how did he manage to get his hands on things like that? On the other hand, all of the evidence Huang provides seems to be compensating for inadequacies in the presidential office's story. For example, Exhibit 12 is a letter from the school registrar dated November 1982. The letter says that Tsai Ing-wen completed her minimum requirement, so she didn't have to register for her course again. That's why her third and fourth year didn't require tuition. Exhibit 14 explains how the London School of Economics helped extend Tsai's student visa from June 1983 to October 1983. That piece of evidence is meant to touch upon Tsai's viva, a topic that the government has been very afraid of. In non-indictment letters that the prosecutor's office sent out, Huang Wei provided a recommendation letter from February 17, 1983, written by Michael Elliott. The letter states that Tsai's viva was going to take place in the upcoming spring of that year. That recommendation letter is problematic to say the least. First, how could Michael Elliott say that Tsai's viva would take place in the spring? He made that statement at a time when Tsai hadn't even finished her thesis yet. How was he so sure that she could finish on time? Furthermore, the letter is riddled with grammatical errors, some of which are common mistakes Chinese speakers make when writing in English. There's just no way the recommendation letter was something Michael Elliott wrote. The recommendation letter exposes another problem. That is, Tsai was having visa issues in early 1983. She had to find work in London in order to complete her studies. In fact, that's something that can be backed up by Tsai's WD on her student record. In order to indict Dr. Peng, Huang Wei must have sifted through mountains of records to stitch together a believable story for Tsai Ing-wen. Huang no doubt read through Tsai's Soochow University records. However, Tsai and her people made one little mistake. In Professor He Defen's case files, Soochow University provided a memo that notified Tsai she passed her viva. However, this one was different from any one we had seen before. This memo was actually signed by the head of the registrar's office, G.F. Roberts. The memo provided in Dr. Peng's indictment letter did not have a signature, and yet the memo included in Professor He's non-indictment letter had one? For now, let's skip past the validity of these documents. Did Huang Wei not realize what a big mistake he was making when he drew up the two letters? The bigger problem for the presidential office is that if the memo with the signature is real, then that means the signatureless memo the presidential office showed to the public is fake. Furthermore, the presidential office actually used that falsified memo to seek legal action against Peng and company. They even used the memo as supplementary material to get Tsai's thesis entered into the National Central Library. The bigger issue is, Huang Wei saw both of these documents and not once did he question Tsai's credibility. Instead, he went ahead with Peng's indictment. Can a prosecutor like him be trusted? The signature isn't the only place where these two memos differ. The addresses provided in the bottom left corner of the documents are also different. When the presidential office first came forth with the signatureless memo, head of the Democracy Times Huang Yuehong analyzed the document. He found that the presidential office's document had been tampered with. Specifically, the address had been changed via photocopy. It seems that his findings are now vindicated. It's clear the presidential office has a room dedicated to producing fake documents. There's nothing to worry about. We have in our hands evidence that proves that even the signed memo is fake. Tsai Ing-wen and her conspirators are getting sloppy. The memo may be what ultimately undoes Tsai's ruse. As early as September 4th, 2019, the presidential office said they were acquiring Tsai's student records from LSE. Our question is, why was that necessary when a copy of Tsai's records should have been kept at the Education Ministry? Why did they have to requisition 37-year-old documents from faraway LSE? The answer is because the files that the Education Ministry has are also fake. The president had to make sure that the information the school had was consistent with what the ministry had. That way, outgoing information was all the same.
9月23号记者会，
彭教授是这份吗？
如果要比对的话，可以显示总统府9月23号的记者会简报资料第一页，总统府所公布的那个是这三者比对是一致的。
After we dug deeper, we found that LSE doesn't keep copies of alumni diplomas. That was when we deduced that the presidential office must have had an operation dedicated to forging documents. It's no wonder why Tsai's team refuses to present any legally binding documents in court. What happened with the two memos is exactly why they cannot take such a risk. The presidential office and education ministry are forging whatever documents they please with the ultimate goal of fooling the public. Now that Prosecutor Huang has showed a hand, it's up to Dr. Peng to sift through it and discover the inconsistencies. On May 26th of this year, LSE employee Luis Nadal told us that records for Tsai's examiners do not exist. Furthermore, the LSE Department of Law does not have any information on Tsai at all. LSE is splitting at the seams now that the tribunal court date is swiftly approaching. A rift is forming between those who choose the truth and those who choose to sustain a lie. Even the ICO has disavowed Tsai's black leather thesis. However, players like University of London Director of Operations Craig O'Callaghan continue to deny. This split that has formed will only get bigger over time. The end result is the truth. Maintain your faith.